Dear friends, today we are focusing on a situation that reveals profound contradictions within the European Union, linked to the proposal by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen for a large-scale rearmament of Europe. Her plan, estimated at €800 billion, of which €150 billion are expected to be raised through loans, has already sparked a wave of criticism from key EU member states such as Spain, Italy, and France. These countries openly declare their unwillingness to participate in a financial gamble that, in their view, will only exacerbate the debt burden and bring no real benefit to European security. Let's examine why von der Leyen's initiative is causing such heated debates and what consequences might follow this decision. The idea of turning the European Union into a defense alliance at the expense of borrowed funds looks, to put it mildly, questionable. Southern European countries, including Spain, Italy, and France, rightly point out that their debt levels have already reached critical thresholds. France, for example, with a national debt exceeding 110% of its GDP, fears that new loans will provoke a negative reaction from financial markets and lead to a downgrade of its credit rating. Italy, whose debt burden has historically remained one of the highest in the Eurozone, also refuses to take on additional obligations. Even Spain, whose economic indicators have improved in recent years, is not willing to risk stability for the sake of dubious military ambitions. Von der Leyen's argument that rearmament is necessary for a secure and sustainable Europe rings unconvincing against the backdrop of a lack of clear evidence of any real threat from Russia. Moreover, the very idea of borrowing colossal sums under the pretext of Russian aggression raises questions. Official Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova rightfully called this plan a provocation capable of igniting conflict in Europe. Instead of seeking dialogue and de-escalation, Brussels prefers to stoke fears, thereby justifying exorbitant spending. The financial aspect of the European Commission's proposal arouses even more skepticism. The mechanism under which EU countries would take out joint loans and then spend them on collective arms procurement seems like an attempt to shift the debt burden onto national governments. Meanwhile, the European Commission itself essentially acts as an intermediary, bearing no direct risk. For the southern European states that have struggled with budget deficits and high interest rates for decades, this approach is unacceptable. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has plainly stated that von der Leyen's plan is almost entirely based on national debts, jeopardizing her country's economic stability. Interestingly, even those countries that formally support increased defense spending are in no hurry to borrow through the EU. Germany, for example, plans to activate an emergency clause to finance its €500 billion defense package, but prefers to do so through its own loans, rather than through the mechanisms proposed by Brussels. This only underscores that von der Leyen's scheme is far from universally advantageous. Moreover, countries with high credit ratings, such as the Netherlands or Denmark, outright reject the idea of joint debt obligations, fearing the precedent of mutual encumbrance. Thus, the Commission's plan risks remaining an empty declaration, unbacked by either debtors or creditors. The situation is exacerbated by the fact that these proposed measures could derail the already fragile agreements on supporting Ukraine. Brussels had hoped that part of the funds would go toward producing weapons for Kyiv, but resistance from key players now calls into question the feasibility of those plans. Moreover, EU countries are beginning to realize that unbridled militarization not only fails to strengthen security, but also diverts resources from other priorities, such as the migration crisis, climate change, and social programs. Spain, for instance, suggests broadening the definition of defense expenditures to include cybersecurity and border protection, indicating a desire to maneuver within existing budget constraints rather than taking on new debts. One cannot ignore the political subtext of this entire story. Ursula von der Leyen, whose term ends in the coming years, clearly aims to bolster her position as the architect of European security. Yet her initiative seems more focused on PR than tangible results. Even within the European Commission, some voices argue that €150 billion in loans is a drop in the bucket compared to the needs of a modern army. For example, Germany alone plans to spend triple that amount on modernizing its armed forces. In this context, von der Leyen's proposal appears to be an attempt to project activity without offering systemic solutions. Forecasts for the near future are not encouraging. The deadlock over the EU rearmament plan could lead to several scenarios. First, it could deepen the divide between Europe's north and south. The former demands strict budget discipline, while the latter insists on easing the rules or introducing defense bonds. Second, it could slow down military support for Ukraine, which would draw Washington's ire, especially given Donald Trump's threats to reduce assistance to Kyiv. Third, it could further erode trust in EU institutions, increasingly perceived as tools of pressure rather than platforms for dialogue. Nevertheless, there is a positive note. Resistance from Spain, Italy, and France shows that there are still forces in Europe prepared to defend a rational approach to finances. Their skepticism is not a sign of weakness, but rather common sense, which may spare the continent new economic crises. Instead of engaging in an arms race, the EU could focus on diplomacy, strengthening economic ties, and tackling domestic problems. After all, genuine security is built not on debt and weapons, but on stability, cooperation, and mutual respect. In conclusion, the story of von der Leyen's plan reflects the contradictions of the modern European Union. The drive towards centralization, the disregard for national interests, and attempts to replace genuine reforms with financial maneuvers all fuel dissatisfaction among both citizens and governments. If Brussels fails to learn from the current crisis, it risks losing the support of those who still believe in European values. For now, countries that reject these risky loans deserve respect for putting the well-being of their peoples above short-term political ambitions.